are not able to participate. There we go. And other housekeeping items, the main form of communication during the presentation will be our chat function. If you're not familiar with the chat, at the bottom of your screen should be a toolbar, and one of those is chat, and it's just like a text message that everybody can see. You can also designate who you might only want to text or chat with one person. So that's a good way to ask like a generic question that maybe we can get to later. And our final round of housekeeping is we will be doing about 20 to 25 minutes of question and answer at the end. So if you have questions, if you can hold them till the end, that would be better. If they're clarifying question, maybe a chat might be a good place to put that. We're going to try not to dwell on the chat questions too heavily during the presentations because it tends to be distracting, but you feel free to enter questions in there and we'll get to them towards the end. So with that, I see we're about 2 minutes into it. We're going to have people kind of continually trickling in over the next 5-10 minutes, but we're not, we don't have the luxury of a lot of time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And again, I'd like to welcome and thank everybody for participating in the first of a two-part series of a webinar or a web meeting, actually, for the Hawaii Dune Restoration Manual. This is a recently released publication from the University of Hawaii Sea Grant program. And we've been working towards developing this Dune manual for a couple years now. And we're really happy to finally have this Dune Restoration Manual out there, which you're going to hear a lot more about here shortly. So with that, I just wanted to mention that we are doing 2 meetings today, and you're welcome to attend both if you want, but they're specifically intended to help address time constraints that people in the morning. So this session from 11 to noon is for anybody that can make it during those hours. And then we wanted to host one later in the day for those that might be working and not able to participate in the middle of the day. So there is another meeting this evening from 5 to 6 p.m. They are going to be identical, although the composition of who's participating looks slightly different, as you might expect. So with that, I think I'll move on to our next slide, if you could, Wes. So just a brief introduction of our agenda. We're getting through our introductions now. The bulk of kind of the introduction of the manual will be conducted by Wes Kreil. You'll hear more about who he is in a second. 20 minutes or so of introduction. Then we're going to have case studies. So each of us with the Hawaii Sea Grant program is going to present a case study of successful dune restoration, and just real simple 3 slides of what that entailed. And then we'll leave time at the end for questions and answers. So that's a kind of open discussion towards the end of the second half of our meeting today. Next slide. Okay, so this is our University of Hawaii Sea Grant program team that worked on the Hawaii Dune Restoration Manual. Tara Owens from Maui in the upper left, Wes Kreil, he's also located on Maui, but he's our statewide dune restoration specialist. And he'll be presenting the bulk of the introduction of the manual here today. Ruby Papp from the island of Kauai. Myself, I'm based here on Oahu, focused on Waikiki, but obviously have an interest in other things outside of Waikiki. Amy Wirtz, who is our Coastal Lands Program Coordinator, working closely with the Department of Land and Natural Resources, and Brad Romine, who's a Coastal Management and Resilience Specialist here at the university. I also want to make special recognition to Trevor Fitzpatrick, who's with us today. He actually was a summer research fellow working with our Sea Grant program that really took the first stab at the first draft of this manual. So thank you, Trevor, for all the hard work that you put in. And it's nice to see it to come to fruition finally a couple years later. So just wanted to acknowledge that. Trevor's also a coastal land specialist planner working with the Department of Land and Natural Resources Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands. So we're well represented here today. And so with that, you can see that there are email addresses in the slides here. If you wanted to reach out to any one of us individually, I would recommend maybe you do that via chat, and we can send you our email addresses. If you're not able to write them down during this slide, we can send you our email addresses directly. Okay, with that, I think I am off to the next slide and transitioning over to Wes, who will be introducing our Dune manual.
All right. Thank you, Dolan. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Like Dolan said, my name is Wes Kreil. I'm the Coastal Dune Restoration Specialist for Sea Grant, based on Maui, but like he was saying, I support projects statewide. So feel free to reach out. I wanted to make it, abundantly clear that this manual is a resource, it's a tool, and it's meant to go in conjunction with Sea Grant Extension faculty. So all the folks that Dolan just introduced, we're here to help implement these, dune restoration projects. And the goal of this manual is to really have more dune restoration in the state of Hawaii. So I'm real excited to have all these technical resources in one place, and and we'll dive right into it and give you a crash course in dune restoration in about 20 minutes. So we'll see how it goes. So diving into the manual, the manual is arranged into the following sections. We start with an overview of the unique coastal environments and processes that are found in the Hawaiian Islands. Talk about the importance of dunes. It then moves into some specific dune management practices or tools that we have in our restoration toolkit. Then an overview of the steps to planning and implementing a dune project. And while they're presented in the manual in a stepwise sequential manner, it's kind of important to note that in reality, those are kind of done concurrently. So they all happen, at the same time in practice. And then finally, there's a chapter on ongoing on ongoing monitoring and maintenance of a restoration site. So there's also some useful information in the appendix. We've got the contacts of all the Sea Grant Extension folks. We've got the coastal and regulatory agency contacts. There's a real extensive list of native dune plants and nurseries for sourcing that plant material for each island. There's a Department of Land and Natural Resources dune management fact sheet, and a case study in the form of Kailua Beach Park Dune Restoration Plan. So why dunes are important? I'm sure lots of you on this call already know why dunes are important, but I wanted to start with a firm foundation. And dunes provide, they provide an alternative to shoreline armoring, to seawalls. They provide really important habitat for native plants and animals, and they provide natural protection for Mauka infrastructure in the form of you have a sand berm that can protect buildings and roads and things further inshore. You can see in this picture in the upper left, when you have degraded dunes or no dunes at all, shoreline erosion looks like this: big chunks of the shoreline cleaving off onto the beach. As an alternative to that, you have healthy dunes over here to the right, where you have nice vegetated sand berm that that protects the beach and nourishes the beach with excess sand as it recovers from high wave events. In general, you can look at this little little graphic over to the left. You have at the top, you have a normal beach profile with a nice wide beach, and then you get a high wave event, and that can erode into the dunes and kind of chew into the sand dunes. But then the beach will go through a period of recovery, and some of that sand from the dunes, it's a stockpile of sand, can move back onto the beach and replenish the beach. So healthy dunes lead to healthy beaches. So what is dune restoration? What are we talking about exactly? Our working definition of dune restoration is working with natural coastal processes to reestablish or rehabilitate a healthy dune ecosystem by encouraging sand accumulation and preventing erosion by planting native plants. We sometimes say it's equal parts science and art. It's a little bit of gardening, a little bit of landscape architecture, and a little bit of scientific coastal processes. It's important to make a quick distinction between beach nourishment, which is also sometimes called beach restoration, and dune restoration. So beach nourishment or beach restoration involves bringing sand in from an outside source, such as pumping it from offshore, and then placing it on the active beach. When we talk about the active beach, that's the wet part of the beach where the waves regularly wash in and out. So beach nourishment is beyond the scope of this tool, this manual. Dune restoration, on the other hand, is conducted further Malca, so further inland. It's above the high wash of the waves, and it, in general, it involves minimal movement of sand or even none at all. So let's move on to some of the specifics of dune management, some of the practices in our toolkit. First on the list is to manage foot traffic. This is a big one because sometimes the biggest enemy to the formation of dunes is human foot traffic, walking, traversing to the beach. So one of the first things we want to do is to designate beach access walkways. And you see this picture over to the right. You can see what happens when beach access is not delineated, and you get a kind of a spider web of paths going every which way. And a lot of these pathways are redundant and all lead to the same place. So we align our pathways to the beach. You can see them on this upper left-hand picture. They need to be aligned. You can see how these are moving at a slight angle because they're oriented perpendicular to the prevailing winds. That prevents sand from blowing down the beach and then taking a Malca turn and blowing up off the beach, and being lost to the beach. That's called dune blowout. And you can kind of see an example of that happening down here on the lower left, where you have all this sand that's blowing out of the system and being lost. So designating walkways, number one. Number two, designate dune restoration areas. So this can be done with simple posts and rope. We tend to do very low profile, so it's minimally intrusive to the beach environment. You can see an example of posts and rope up in the upper left there. You can use wooden fencing, post and rail, like down here on the lower left. Can be really any material that matches the natural aesthetic. And then we accompany any delineation of a dune restoration area with signage. And it's really important to put signage up because we don't want to give the perception that we're limiting any sort of beach access. So in the state of Hawaii, access to the beach is protected by state law. And so we want to make sure that dune restoration should never give the impression that it's impeding access. So that's why we designate those pathways and really enhance the access in many cases. The interesting thing about designating the restoration areas is that oftentimes as soon as you eliminate the trampling of foot traffic over those areas, the dune plants will recover on their own and kind of recolonize that area over time. The seed banks of the native plants are there, and just eliminating the pressure of people walking on it can lead to recovery. So moving on, our next tool in the restoration toolkit is to remove obstructions and invasive species. When we're talking about obstructions, that's defined as anything that impedes the natural flow of wind, sand, and waves along the shoreline. It can be in the form of human-made rubble, asphalt, debris, old concrete, old irrigation pipes. We have all kinds of strange things along our shoreline, especially when we have an actively eroding shoreline and those things are being exposed and eroding out of the shore. So also another type of obstruction is vegetative in nature. So you can see in this upper left-hand picture, you have a big, sort of a big green wall of irrigated naupaka that is, growing too close to the ocean. We like native plants, and naupaka is a native plant, but in areas close to a watered landscape, such as a resort or someone's yard, those plants get overwatered and they can grow really, really tall and kind of creep down onto the active beach. Where they create a barrier to the natural flow of sand. Another common example over here on the right is ironwood trees. Invasive ironwood trees can grow right down onto the beach, and then they erode out and fall out of the sand and create a hazard along the coastline. So once we've removed those obstructions, we can plant the native vegetation. And we sometimes refer to native plants as nature's rebar in concrete. It's very, very effective at holding the sand, but not holding it so tightly that it's not accessible to the beach after those big storm events. And so for those purposes, our Hawaii Dune Most Valuable Plant Award goes to two plants, which is the pahuihui, also known as the beach morning glory, and the akeake grass. And you can see some pictures of them here. These plants are very well adapted to their the harsh conditions on a shoreline. They can withstand heat, sun, salt, and very little water. And you can see what they do over here on the right. You can see these heart-shaped leaves of the pahuihui actually capture windblown sand and funnel it down to the base of the plant, and allows that sand to accumulate over time, and that builds the dunes. So these plants can survive being buried. They can, they're essential to any dune restoration activity, and we use them in almost all of our restoration projects. These are the types of plants that are appropriate close to the ocean. They hold the sand very effectively, but they still make it accessible during periods of high waves. It's important to remember that dunes are very dynamic systems. The sand comes and goes, and so we want the plants that are adapted to those sort of conditions. These plants can easily recover after a big storm event. So the next couple of tools in our kit are considered optional. It really just depends on how quickly we want a dune to become established. Just eliminating the foot traffic is often all that needs to happen, and then those dunes can start to rebuild and the native plants will come on their own. We can plant the plants to make it go a little faster, and then this is another option. We can install sand fencing, which is this product you see here in the picture. It's sort of acts in a similar way as a plant. It's installed perpendicular to the prevailing winds, and as the sand moves down, it hits that barrier and falls out of the wind and accumulates over time at the base of the sand fence. It can really quickly create a dune in an area where there's a lot of wind-blown sand moving around. Some of the trade-offs with this product is that it has to be maintained or it starts to look a little ratty, and and eventually it has to be removed or it'll get buried. So along the same lines, if we want to create dunes more quickly, we can actually rebuild those dunes. This is done by pushing sand up into a dune and then stabilizing it with dune plants like pahuihui and akeake grass. You can see in this picture in the upper left and lower right, that's they're skimming the top 6 to 8 inches of sand off of the beach and pushing it up the coast into dunes. That's one source of potential source of sand. Another source may be from a nearby stream mouth. In many parts of the state, there are streams that have a little sand plug at the mouth of the stream that's regularly cleared for flooding or drainage purposes, and it can be appropriate in cases to use that sand to create dunes in the immediate area. Also, you might find sand up on a roadway or in a parking lot where it blew off the beach, and it makes sense to, that's a precious resource and it should be reintroduced back to the beach. So those are also potential sources for sand. And this last one in our toolkit is the construction of elevated boardwalks or walkways. This might make sense in an area that has a lot of heavy traffic, where lots of people are accessing the beach. It allows for people to traverse over the dunes without touching them at all, and so it can really reduce the impact on the dune landscape. Some considerations when you're considering installing dune walkover is they often have to be ADA compliant, Americans with Disabilities Act compliant, which says that basically from the handicap parking place in like a public park from that place all the way to the beach has to be a certain slope ratio on the on the boardwalk so that wheelchairs can access the beach. And they generally require advanced carpentry skills or a knowledgeable contractor. Although we have had volunteer groups construct ADA compliant walkways at some of our restoration sites here in Maui. So it is doable with a community group. So those are the practices of dune restoration in a nutshell. It's not really rocket science. It's putting sand into a pile and stabilizing it with plants. But there's a lot more to it when it comes down to the implementation steps. So I'm going to jump into the implementation of a restoration project. And again, keeping in mind that these steps don't always go sequentially. So first and foremost, we have just observation of the site, hilo, the Hawaiian word for to observe. So look at the site conditions. This is where you want to work closely with the Sea Grant staff, the folks that are on this call, and start to understand the local coastal processes. Where does the wind come from? Where does sand move around? Are there seasonal variabilities in the area? There are lots of. It's good to understand the permitting requirements at this point as well. Restoration projects tend to come from a lot of different sources, or there's a different impetus to starting a restoration project. In our work as extension agents, we work closely with shoreline planners at the different counties, and so sometimes a permit will trigger a restoration project. And other times it can be maybe there's a problem. Hey, this area is really eroding, and there's a local community group that says, hey, can we do something about this? And maybe dune restoration might be an appropriate mitigation measure there. So we work closely with nonprofits, community groups, landowners, and really anyone interested in restoring dunes. So it's important to learn the user profile of the area that you're working in too. Who are the primary users of the beach? Are they fishermen? Are they swimmers, snorkelers, kite surfers, fishermen, all of the above? Who uses and who accesses the beach? So it's important to start identifying those key stakeholders or people that are very interested in that site. This can be a good time to reach out to cultural practitioners, cultural representatives. Are there traditional Hawaiian practitioners that utilize this area? We get a lot of great information from lineal descendants and longtime residents that are very familiar with the seasonal changes and the historical context of an area. It's important to involve the local Aha Moku Council. The mokus are traditional Hawaiian districts that are found throughout the islands, and it's important to know what moku you're doing a restoration project in. And each one of those mokus has a representative that you can reach out to. And then, of course, the permitting agencies from the state and county side. So step 3 is to develop a site plan. And a site plan can be a complicated architectural blueprint type of plan that an engineer would do, or it can be as simple as a Google Earth image with some hand-drawn features on it, like this one. It shows the different restoration areas, outlines them, details the pathways, shows prominent features like streams or beach parking or whatever. And it also provides something that you can share with those stakeholders that you're engaging with. Allows them to provide feedback and say, oh, hey, maybe you should consider another pathway over here, or fishermen like to use this particular area, maybe you should consider that. And then it's also, the site plan is the basis for any permits that are needed. On the state side, you need a site plan approval, and then on the county side with the special management area or SMA permit, they'll require a site plan as well. So the more detail in the site plan, the better. And then this one is kind of obvious, but you've got to implement the plan. This can be done. This is when all that stakeholder engagement it's done early in the process is it really pays off. You can use volunteers to help with the actual work, or hired contractors as needed. And it's important to continue that outreach throughout the implementation stages so that people know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's important. And then finally, we want to monitor and maintain the sites. Dune restoration projects in general don't have a huge maintenance burden. The plants that we're using are well adapted to the area. They do require a little bit of irrigation just to get them established in the first 2 to 3 months, but then you can turn off that water and remove that irrigation and the plants will be fine. It's actually very important that you don't overwater dune plants because you're really just going to encourage invasive weeds and other things that are going to make the maintenance more difficult. So other monitoring activities involve replacing posts and rope, replacing the fencing, making sure the signage is all in good shape, and making sure that people are utilizing the pathways that you've designated. Some of the monitoring indicators that we can use. The most simple is really just like you see here, before, during, and after pictures. You know, what did the site look like before the restoration was done, and how does it look now? Are there more appropriate native plants growing? Are there a greater variety of native plants? Has the sand accumulated? Is there maybe a reduced flooding occurrence? If you have a healthy dune, the waves can't wash up over the dune and flood, you know, infrastructure or things that are located Malca. And of course, you can also look at increased access or increased cultural uses of the site. Those would also be indicators of success. And then of course, topographic monitoring that can be in the form of a survey, just monitoring how much sand is accumulating over time. So I'm going to kick it back over to Dolan. We're going to, that was a very quick overview of the manual, and hopefully you're all experts in dune restoration now. And I'll kick it over to Dolan to talk through some case studies. We're going to provide some examples from around the state. So start off with Dolan on the first one.
Yeah, thank you, Wes. Yeah, great overview of the manual. Hopefully all of you have seen in the chat a link to the Dune restoration manual. If you haven't seen it yet, we would encourage you to download it, take a look. It's available online, but I would download it to your computer if you have that ability. But getting into our case studies here, you can see we have a number of case studies around the state, the first of which is on the island of Oahu at Sunset Beach Park. Hopefully many of you know where this is. It's the world famous Sunset Beach where all the big waves are. Pipeline is just down the coast from here. It's a heavily impacted park in that there's a huge number of people that visit many of these beach parks on a daily basis. But back in 2017, 18, and it's kind of been on and off for the last 10 years, but 2017 and 18 in particular were highly erosive to this beach park. And here you can see an image of the bike path and its imminent failure because it got undermined. That bike path was abandoned and subsequently relocated more landward, about 20 feet more landward into the parking lot. But as a result of that, it spurred a lot of community interest in restoring the dune. And here you can see kind of an after shot after the dune has been restored. And one of the key elements to this particular project is the community participation. This is, there's no private property located in this dune restoration project. It was all within City and County of Honolulu Beach Park. And that creates its own complications, of course, but it also streamlined things in that there were no concern over private vested property rights or any of that. So it was purely in the public domain and in the public interest to restore the dune here. If you go to the next slide, Wes. And this is just kind of a sequence of shots on the top, or kind of the top left is the before shots, removing the concrete or the asphalt walkway, and you can see how bad. And historically, there never was a dune in this area, primarily because there was so much foot traffic erosion, the dune couldn't survive. They're just people trampling it all day long. That and the fact that every now and then it would get eroded out like this, maybe every 15 years or so. Not quite as severe as what you see in these images. So one of the key elements here, because there was such a large drop off, was sand pushing was employed by the city to bring the sand further down on the beach profile, back up and reshape a dune, what would have been the more natural shape of the dune, and at least to bring it up to level with that walkway elevation so that there wasn't a big drop off. The community group here also put in paths and had pads for people to walk across, and even some experimental stairs that are kind of in demonstration mode as we speak. And then you can see in the bottom images there, the community level of effort with the planting of some of the species that Wes had talked about. And then on the left, bottom left there is kind of what it looks like now, is the naupaka and some of the shrubs are starting to take hold in this area. One of the things that I can't emphasize enough in this particular project was the fencing was absolutely key to the success of this project. And surprisingly, we thought there would be a lot of pushback from the community of having dedicated access ways, maybe 50 to 100 feet apart. In the beginning, it was complicated. We had this orange construction fence you can see in the image that was replaced by a wood perimeter fence that just simply told people kind of, please stay out of the area. It's a dune restoration. And now the vegetation is pretty well established, largely in part because there isn't foot traffic erosion over it. So the key to that was, of course, keeping people off the dune and having the access ways built in. Some of the opportunities that we experienced with this particular project, community driven. This was largely led by the North Shore Community Land Trust, and they employed an army of volunteers to come in and do all the labor volunteer. Actually, they had donations from the World Surf League because they do run a surf contest at this location. They donated the money for all the landscaping, for all the plants. There was a huge reduction in liability for the county with not having a big drop off on this public walkway, bike path. And also the bike path was immediately in front of, and a portion of it still is immediately in front of the state highway. So it's in our interest to protect this area before it gets to the highway, and that might result in more aggressive erosion control measures like seawalls and armoring, things like that. There's also a financial element here with annual sand pushing that the city would do has been greatly reduced. The frequency and volume of sand that needs to be moved has been cut like in 1/10 of what it used to be, because people aren't walking down the beach in all over the whole area, only in the right-of-ways. Some of the challenges with this location: extreme wave exposure, the North Shore of Oahu. I don't think I need to speak to that. Hopefully everybody's aware of that. The heavy foot traffic erosion was also extreme in this location. I mentioned earlier about the restricting access required fencing. Otherwise, this would have not succeeded like it has. And of course, it goes without saying that you don't just build it and walk away. It takes continual maintenance. And this is where the community element was highly successful in being a volunteer labor force that's ready to go. They bring their own materials and do repairs as needed. So I will stop there, and we can move on to our next case study.
Hello, everyone. This is Tara Owens on Maui. I'm bringing you a case study from Maui. And the idea here is to share a few different cases that have sort of different flavors. And maybe one of these may relate to something you're thinking about, a challenge or an opportunity or a site you may have in mind. So this one here is at Kamaole One Beach Park in South Maui, the Kihei area. And this was a project where many groups, as in Dolan's case, it takes a village. In this case, various county departments, Sea Grant, and volunteers as well, partnered to carry out a dune restoration by beneficially using sand that was dredged about a mile down the coast from the Kihei boat ramp. And that's a boat ramp that's managed by the state. And I won't get into all the details, but on this image, if Wes can help me out, I did want to point out some of the features. You can see the dune restoration area. Wes actually showed this image earlier, and you'll see some of the elements he was referring to, the designated pathways and the native plants and some of the perimeter fencing, all important elements. And I also want to point out the public infrastructure. So there's, all this public infrastructure gets a protective benefit from having healthy dunes. So we've got the road, South Kihei Road, major thoroughfare, we've got a comfort station, and we have actually a wastewater or sewer pump station. That was all protected by this project. So next slide, please. And this is a series of photos that shows the stages of the project. So up in the top left, you have it's hard to see from this angle in that photo, but there's a large gap in the dunes fronting the wastewater pump station. And there are flattened areas that Wes was pointing out there where foot traffic had been very heavy at this well-loved and well-used beach park. And then in the top right, you can see sand placement. And so this is when the sand from the Kihei boat ramp was transferred to this location and placed within the dune restoration area. In the bottom left, you can see another view of the sand placement, and this is directly looking Mauka toward the pump station, the wastewater pump station. And finally, in the bottom right, this image shows the reestablishment of the native plants, which in this case is mainly pohui or beach morning glory. Next slide, please. And as takeaways in terms of opportunities, there's been a long-standing dune restoration program in South Maui, mostly managed by volunteers. So this was not a new idea, and folks generally understood what to expect, and that was an advantage for us. We were also able to take advantage of dredged sand from the nearby boat ramp and make sure that it was kept here in this region and in this beach system. So not carried away from the system and not taken to another part of the island. And then there were multiple resilience outcomes. So not only did we help preserve and reinforce the natural ecosystem, there was also a benefit to the critical infrastructure. So it's always a good when there's dual benefit. However, there was a lot of behind the scenes work, as there always is, to connect the dots to enable this project. And so in terms of challenges, there was and continues to be a lack of pre-planning for these regular dredging projects. And this is something we know we all need to work on collectively. And that meant that when the time came, there was a need for quick funding. And that can be really hard for the county and state. Their budgets are not set up to necessarily be quickly adaptable. But we did find a working solution in this case. And you can see the result of that. And then one other point, while permits are very, very important for any project on the shoreline to ensure that best management practices are followed, this project and others like it have required multiple county permits for what is considered an environmentally beneficial project. And this is something I've heard from other environmental groups doing other kinds of beneficial projects like signage, coral reef signage, or rain gardens that, having to navigate the permitting system can be a challenge. And I just, of course, want to acknowledge the many, many partners, namely the South Maui volunteers and multiple offices within the County of Maui. Thank you. And I guess I'm turning it over to Ruby next.
Hi, everyone. This is Ruby over here on Kauai. I'll try to go through this case quickly. We want to have plenty of time for your questions at the end. But this next case is an example of passive restoration, actually, at Salt Pond Beach Park in Hanapepe on the island of Kauai. This area is home to a very important Hawaiian salt making area. Wes, I don't know if you were able to point that out. Thank you. And the salt makers have spent the most time here, generations and generations of Hawaiians have used kilo over time to really understand what was going on. And they observed that the use of vehicles on the beach was deflating the dune, which historically had protected the pond from large waves during the summer salt making season. This pond actually needs to be dry in order to make salt. This picture just happened to be taken during the winter when it's normal to have some flooding in there from the rains. So the Hui Hana Pa'akai, the salt makers group, took action by holding several meetings with the Hanapepe community and the county of Kauai, who managed the park. And as a result of this community work, the Hui gained the blessing of the community to place boulders to restrict vehicles driving on the beach. So removing obstructions. Although the activity of beach driving is already illegal, as many of us know, it had continued for so long unenforced, it was necessary for the community to come together and to really understand the impacts and be on board for making changes at their local beach. As a result of restricting the access, the beach in Dune has slowly reestablished itself and recovered, as shown here in the pictures on the right. The salt making season for this year has probably actually been saved by the dune, because we did have that giant July swell. And the water has actually flooded parts of the pond, but not the salt making area. So I do credit having a healthier berm there to protect that pond. And the vegetation here is a kuli kai that's been reestablishing itself here. The major pluses, so yes, next slide, thank you. From this example is that the project was completely community driven and accepted, and very little funds were required, just a lot of community time. So if you want to count that as funds, that is actually time. Time is money, right? But not cash. And the challenge here is that there's obviously a longer timeline for results when you're just doing a passive restoration. And the big challenge was actually taking on sort of the beach driving culture that had grown over, at least in recent history. It had to be delicately handled with the community. And the Hui Hana Pa'akai did an amazing job with this, getting the community together, along with the Hanapepe Elieli Community Association or Neighborhood Association. Sorry if I got that wrong. Not sure which one it is, as well as the county of Kauai, who ultimately placed the boulders to restrict the vehicles from the beach. And so I think Wes has our last example from back on Maui.
There we go. Okay, back on Maui. Now we're moving over to the North Shore. This is the Kapuka Ulua, or also known as Baldwin Beach restoration effort. And this is a planning effort, so this project has not been implemented yet, but we wanted to show this one as an example of a real community inclusive, community driven planning effort that is going to result in a very large scale shovel ready project that we're looking to implement in the next 3 to 4 years. So it's located up here. This is Baldwin Beach Park is right here, and Lower Paia Park is here, and you can see this is a very large restoration zone, you know, along this stretch of coastline. Real important, just not going to go into too much detail, but we had over a year and a half worth of outreach and engagement with the community. Because this area is so near and dear to so many people's hearts, we wanted to make sure that the community understood what we were doing and they were on board with what we were proposing, and that they had a really good chance to you know, include their feedback into the restoration designs. So we had an advisory group. We had 2 advisory group meetings. We had informal talk story sessions. This was during the pandemic, so we had to do a lot of Zoom work until later in the project. We had an advisory group member survey that asked, you know, what people wanted for this area. We had a visit from the Ahamoku folks that we went out there and discussed cultural concerns. and even student-led interviews on site with some of the key stakeholders. And all of that feedback kind of fed into these, what we were calling, guiding principles for the project. And these are directly from the advisory group. Protect cultural resources. There are known archaeological sites in the area, Iwi Kupuna, and that was first and foremost our protection of those resources. Making the beach safe, getting rid of some of the debris that was along the shoreline. No sand from the land, keeping the sand local to the area, not bringing in sand from an external source. And so all of these guiding principles fed into our restoration plans, which here's a little example of one over here, which we show the different restoration pathways, the restoration zones, the sand fencing, and we try to incorporate as much of the community feedback as possible. And like I said, now we have a shovel-ready plan that we're hoping to implement in the next few years. Key takeaways from this project were we had great community support for dune restoration. We had a chance to manage this severely eroding stretch of shoreline and in a real holistic, ongoing way, remove some of that dangerous debris off the beach, and again, really create a gold standard of dune restoration. It's our hope that there'll be lessons learned from this project that can inform sites, around the state. Some of the challenges with this planning process were, making sure to address those cultural concerns. We wanted to have several different options for how we went about conducting the restoration so that we could make sure that those resources were protected. Differentiating between the dune restoration part of the process and a concurrent effort to do a park master plan. So the park master plan was looking at bathrooms and parking, and we were looking at pathways and dune restoration. So making sure to make that distinction. Of course, the multiple state and county permits, and then incorporating feedback from so many stakeholders can be challenging. There were so many people that really care about this stretch of coastline that we wanted to make sure we got as much feedback as we possibly could. And then just a quick shout out to the 25 members of the Kapuka-Alua advisory group. We couldn't have done it without them, and those folks' time and input were essential. So that was a lot to cover, but we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. I saw some coming in the chat.
Yeah, we had one question in the chat that was answered by Dolan, but I want to invite folks to either unmute themselves to ask or raise their hand or put questions in the chat. Either way that you feel, any way that you feel comfortable with. We have about 10 minutes left of our regular program, but we went a bit over, so we're happy to stay to about 10 after if folks want to stay on and talk story. So yeah, any new questions coming up? A question from Luann. Do you want to unmute yourself, or would you like me to? I'll just go ahead and read it out. Do you have any plans for Mo'omomi on Molokai?
Wes, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
Sure, I can take that. I guess we don't have any direct plans for Mo'omomi right now. Mo'omomi, for folks that don't know, is a very unique example of a dune, an alien or wind-blown dune ecosystem on Molokai. And there's some really great restoration efforts going on out there. We support those efforts. We're looking to learn from those efforts. And hopefully this dune manual will contribute to the ongoing work out there. I did want to note that this manual is considered a working document. So restoration practitioners like the folks at Mo'omomi or other places around the state, please share your feedback and information that you've learned by doing dune restoration so we can incorporate it into the further iterations of the manual.
Thanks, Wes. I see Roberts and then Sarah, sir. You want to unmute yourself, Roberts?
Yes. I have a question for Wes as it relates to his community outreach and meetings. And I noted that he had down, I think it was Zoom meetings. And I noticed that he had 3. I'm curious what the spacing was on the 3. And I was curious from a compare and contrast perspective, a live meeting versus a Zoom meeting. How do you differentiate those? We're planning some meetings. We're trying to plan a little bit of each, and I'm not really sure which would be most advantageous or why.
Mhm.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Great question. I mean, we took everything online because of the pandemic. It probably wouldn't have been our first choice for outreach for the Kapuka Ulua project. But in all honesty, it worked out really well. We had 2 formal advisory group meetings that were, they were formal. We had an agenda, and they were very structured, where we were presenting details of the project and getting feedback. But then what we found really, really useful was these informal, we just called them Zoom talk story sessions, where we just sort of like office hours, where we'll be on Zoom from this period to this period, and we tried to have some daytime and evening sessions, so that, and we just opened it up to anyone in the advisory group that wanted to hop on there and talk story. And honestly, the flexibility of that, of having it virtually and allowing people to just hop on when they wanted to was really useful, and we got a lot of really good feedback that way. Later on in the project, we did start to, as things started to open up, we had a few site visits on site. Nothing really beats meeting at the location and walking the site and pointing things out. We did that on Google Earth virtually, but I think the hybrid approach, doing a little bit of both, is really useful. That'd be my recommendation.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Sarah?
Hi, hi. Thank you, first of all, for having this for community members. I live on Kailua Beach on Oahu, and I live behind Kalapoi Market. So I noticed in the manual that there is a Kailua Beach restoration dune project. It sounded from the manual that it was maybe in progress or for future. I was wondering what the status was of that dune project for Kailua Beach.
Dolan, you want to take that one?
Yeah,
Or?
I might be able to address that. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for attending too. There isn't an active dune restoration project at Kailua Beach Park yet. That is the intention. I've been communicating and coordinating with the city and county parks department. They, as you might expect, are hugely supportive of this idea, but are a bit limited on capacity and staff to actually do it. So I'm writing my second and possibly third research grant proposal to fund the design, development, and implementation of a dune restoration project. We'll call it a pilot for now, but the intention is to restore the dune throughout the Kailua Beach Park area. And the key to this, which is somewhat unique, but not the only place that this involves using the sand plug from the river mouth. The Ka'elepulu stream enters right in the middle of the park, and how that sand is managed is really key to the dune restoration effort. So it's a source of sand that's kind of a recycling type project. So stay tuned for more. Nothing active right now, but we are working on getting some funding to do a restoration plan. There'll be community meetings and that type of thing around that too.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So we have a question in the chat from Kitty Courtney. Hi, Kitty. Glad you're here. What was or should be the role of the state in these projects? Kind of a broad question there. I think obviously I'll try to take it on. I mean, there's obviously the State Department of Natural Resources Office of Coastal Lands, which has jurisdiction over almost all of our beaches. So obviously they would play a key role. They actually also have, as I understand it, they have some funding that may be available in the future that that may be an option. And they're also a permitting agency. So, and we also, I want to give a shout out to Amy Wertz, who's on the line. She's our Sea Grant Extension agent that works with the Office of Coastal Lands. For those of you who haven't met Amy, I don't know if you want to add a couple sentences to what I said, or just say hello.
Yeah, hello everyone. I would say from the OCCL perspective, many of these projects, though not all, would, in addition to the county permitting, require from OCCL a site plan approval as well. So there's a role for the state there. And then there's also a role for other agencies in the state. Many of these projects are going to involve heavy SHPD, the State Historic Preservation Division. I think I got all those letters right. Due to the potential for EV in the dunes and other cultural resources. So there's a few different places, and the OCCL permitting for these types of projects would definitely incorporate ensuring that those other state agencies with equities in the dune restoration area are also involved for comment and any permitting that might be required there. And other than that, also the Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands works closely with the county representatives through our Sea Grant Extension agents and Wes and Tara on Kauai and Maui, respectively, to identify these project areas and work towards getting good dune restoration in place.
Awesome, thanks.
Could I add something real quick to that? I just posted in the chat a link to the Kailua Beach and Dune management plan. This was done about 10 years ago. And feel free to check it out if you like, but I wanted to share that as an example of the DLNR Office of Conservation Coastal Lands interest in supporting the dune restoration management plan back then, at least 10 years ago. So another example beyond regulatory role. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the OCCL does have an interest in supporting these projects, and that's one of many examples that we can point to.
Thank you. So we have a great question from Nancy McPherson from DHHL. Suggestions on how best to coordinate dredging activities with dune restoration activities between agencies. This is a great question because we know different agencies are on different timelines and have different goals with regard to like keeping waterways open versus restoring the dunes. So how do we best get the bang for our buck when those when perhaps valuable sand could be become available? I don't have a whole lot of experience with this, Tara.
Ruby,
Yeah,
I can take, just because I think maybe Nancy's asking in response to the case study that I presented, which was involving sand dredged from a nearby boat ramp. And I've asked myself the same very good question many times, Nancy, because in that particular case, what happened was they had to do an emergency dredge cycle because the boat ramp had filled up with so much beach sand that boats were grounding. And so during that emergency situation, the state agency that manages the harbors, DOBOR, didn't actually have a plan for the sand they were dredging, other than they knew they wanted to see it end up on a beach at some point. So we were able to connect the dots, but it happened sort of in a reactive capacity rather than a proactive capacity. And I just recently brought this up to the new leadership at DLNR OCCL, and we have Amy now in that office. I mean, just one idea that I have would be to maybe start establishing MOAs or MOUs, memorandums of agreement, between maybe the state and the county and or even organizations like Sea Grant, so that we're prepared for this ahead of time and we sort of have a pre-plan for potential placement locations. That's one thought. And I do just want to say one other thing. Sometimes harbors do not have good beach quality sand, and it is not of a quality that we should be putting on any beaches or dunes. So I'd say that's the case probably as many times as not. So we know a few locations where we're likely to get beach quality sand, and those are the ones we'd want to focus on.
Do we have more questions? Sorry, I was answering someone's question in the chat and I lost track of, well, we have another one. I also want to pause and give people a chance to feel like it's okay if they want to leave, because I know we're at the top of the hour. So we don't want to keep people here. If you need to go ahead to have your lunch or other meetings, go ahead. I'm happy to stay on. I think we're all happy to stay on for a few more minutes. So thank you so much for participating. Loved all the interest. We have another one from Nancy too. Concerns about impacting the estuarine fish nursery functions of the mulivai if removing sand plugs from the streams, such as at Kaunakakai harbor dredging.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. That was in response to the previous.
Oh, okay, that
question.
didn't happen there. Okay, thanks,
Yeah.
Nancy. Thanks for clarifying.
So that was
Yeah,
actually Anahola River is what I'm thinking of.
Anahola.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the key there is knowing, and maybe it's an area of our knowledge that we need to develop more, but knowing how much sand to actually take from a mulivai. Like, do you want to just remove the whole thing in one fell swoop, or is there, you know, is there fish in there growing, and would that interrupt their process? I think there's little, to be honest, I think it is a concern. And there has been little published on that. And I know DLNR was doing an estuary study for a while, and the contact on that, someone can help me out. Kimberly Payton was the contact at DLNR DAR, and that would be somebody to reach out to. I think she would have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and Nancy, just to add to that, I really appreciate the question. You know, you kind of highlight the fact that it's not a one size fits all situation for dune restoration. It was really difficult when developing this manual to give general guidance, because while it may be appropriate to remove sand from a stream mouth plug in one place on one island, you know, that I don't want to imply that that's you know, always the case. And we do recognize that this is a bit of a knowledge gap. We did have a proposal, I think last year, to do more of a stream mouth management guidance document, and that it unfortunately didn't get funded last year, but it is something that we're looking at, and recognizing that it's not one size fits all. In some cases, you know, if there's a flooding risk, maybe you do want to open that up at a certain threshold, but also recognizing the real important ecosystem functions that those sand berms do. You know, they provide habitat for fish, and they're that nexus between the estuary and the ocean. So yeah, really good point. Thanks.
Ruby, I had a question that came to me directly in text, so maybe I can share that one.
And then I know Roberts has his hand up. I
Okay.
don't know if that was from before, or if you have a new question.
New question.
Okay, so
Let Roberts
either
go
way.
ahead, and then
Okay.
I'll follow up. Yep.
So on dune restoration, one of the focus is obviously roots, and it seems like there's a lot of emphasis on endemics these days, which suggests that you're going to be dealing with weeds. And I'm curious, it seems like that's really an ongoing issue, especially because the weeds just keep coming. So if you're going to build into a grant, what sort of resources, or how long a tail, or how much, how do you factor in the weed control aspect of it? Obviously, it would vary with the size of the area you're dealing with, and maybe the kinds of weeds. But you know, I've listened to a lot of people's presentations about their successes, and when you bring up the question of weeds, all of a sudden their head goes, "Oh yeah, weeds." You know, it's a big deal. If your goal is to get rid of the weeds, if your goal is to have just have a lot of nice roots out there, well, then maybe it doesn't matter at all. Anyway, food for thought. Any comments?
Wes?
Try to
Yeah.
can try to take that one. Sure. Yeah. No, it's again, probably a similar response to the last question. Like it's never a one size fits all. In the drier parts of the island, the key to reducing that weed barrier, or that those weeds popping up in the dunes, is really that irrigation piece. So like I said, dunes don't need excess irrigation. They need just a tiny bit to get established. And I mean, really, as soon as you can tell that those plants are growing and thriving, just turn that irrigation off and you eliminate a huge invasive weed burden. That said, yeah, these are managed systems. They do require ongoing maintenance. But in terms of, we're focusing on the natives. I think this is an important point to make. The key is to hold the sand with roots, but not hold it so tightly that it's not accessible to the beach. So that's why we focused on like pahui and aki grass. Like those are the plants that are appropriate closest to the ocean. As you move Mauka, there's different areas of the dune where different plants are more appropriate, and getting that mix right is really important. And also those plants are adapted to where they want to grow in the dune profile, so they tend to thrive in those different zones. So take a look at our plant guidance in the appendix, and it lays out those different zones really well, and it talks a little bit about some of we thought about including a what not to plant section, but we didn't do that in the end. But things like how ironwoods, piave to a larger extent too. These are plants that we deal with all the time that are kind of are invasive. What else? The other one, Pluchea plants are also another invasive one. But yeah, it's a really good point.
Tara, was there another question in the chat?
Yeah, the question that I got was, does the Hawaii Dune Restoration Manual, this comes from Molokai, does the manual supersede the Papahaku Dune Cultural and Natural Resources Preservation Plan? It's a good question. I can't remember what year that plan was published, but this was a dune preservation plan that was carried out by the University of Hawaii Department of Urban and Regional Management cohort that year. In fact, I think Nancy McPherson here on the phone was a big part of that plan, and it's an amazing document. And I would just say that this dune manual does not supersede that plan. I would think they would be very complementary resources. And we've learned through experience over the years by developing plans like the Papahaku plan, doing projects like some of the ones you saw, and all of that knowledge and experience went into the dune manual, and of course we'll continue learning as we go. So definitely complementary materials there. Thank you.
Cool. One more came in. Let's see. From Tammy Harp. Could the sand fence / pahuehue concept be utilized as an alternate for the Ka'anapali beach sand replenishment? They're looking at dredging sand offshore to place on the 1.5-mile stretch of Canoe Beach to Pu'ukeika'a. Wes and Tara.
Okay, the question is, sorry, I was answering questions in chat. Tammy's question is, could you essentially do a dune restoration or a vegetation management project in association with the Ka'anapali beach renourishment project?
I think an alternate, she says, as an alternative to that project.
As an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective as a coastal processes specialist, I would say that those would be complementary projects in a best case scenario. So, there are places, especially on the southern Ka'anapali shoreline between Canoe Beach and like the Hyatt and the Marriott and Hana'o Point, where the beach is severely degraded and almost you would consider it lost beach at this point. So I think the beach nourishment project will be a good step forward upon which you could build on to do some vegetation management and dune restoration. And I would like to see that be part of the project. Although I think some coordination still needs to happen, you know, to plan for that and make it possible. It's a really good question. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Any others, or let's see, I haven't looked at to see if anyone's hands are up. I don't see anything. If there isn't any other questions, I would suggest that this is a great time to sign off. And Wes, you are still screen sharing, by the way, so you might want to stop share there. We can see your academia search.
Gotcha. I was just looking at the Papahaku Dunes, man.
Yeah, there's a lot of great resources in the chat.
Thank you.
By the way, if anyone has, no one's checked that area in a while, you can download those. And I'm just getting mahalos at this point. So I would just like to say mahalo for everyone that attended. We will be repeating this webinar at 5. The material will be exactly the same, except the conversation will probably be different. So up to you if you want to attend. And otherwise, say ahui ho, mahalo.
Mahalo. Great
Aloha,
job.
everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Nancy. Take care.
I was going to say, guys, we could do a quick debrief, but looks like there's some folks still that might have their Zooms on. So,
Hey, Ruby, do you want to stop the recording and then we can stay on maybe for a debrief?
yeah, thanks for the reminder. I always forget that. Stop record. Where is that? Stop.